The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the grand ballroom as hundreds of distinguished guests mingled in their finest evening wear. But beneath the glittering surface of this prestigious charity gala, an ancient protocol was about to clash with modern royal dynamics in a way that would send shockwaves through the British establishment. For 60 years, one particular seat had remained untouched during formal events at Buckingham Palace, a chair that bore the invisible weight of memory, love, and loss. Tonight, as Queen Camilla approached that very seat with the confidence of her newfound title, she had no idea that her simple action would trigger a confrontation that would test the very foundations of royal tradition. What happened next would be whispered about in palace corridors for years to come, reminding everyone present that some boundaries, even in death, remain sacred and fiercely protected. The golden autumn evening wrapped around Buckingham Palace like a silk scarf, and inside the state ballroom, the annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala was about to begin. Lady Margaret Thornberry, the event organizer, stood at the entrance checking her clipboard for the 100th time that evening. Everything had to be perfect. The guest list read like a who's who of British society, with members of Parliament, celebrities, business moguls, and of course senior members of the royal family expected to attend. Queen Camilla arrived fashionably late, as was customary for someone of her standing. Her deep emerald evening gown complemented the Duchess of Cornwall's sapphire tiara, and she moved through the crowd with practiced grace. The guests parted naturally as she made her way through the room, offering respectful nods and curtsies as she passed. Behind her, two ladies-in-waiting followed at a discreet distance, while her personal protection officer maintained visual contact from across the room. The ballroom itself was a masterpiece of royal grandeur. Massive oil paintings of past monarchs gazed down from gilded frames, while the famous crystal chandeliers that had witnessed centuries of royal celebrations cast warm light across the polished marble floors. Fresh white roses and baby's breath had been arranged in towering displays throughout the room, their subtle fragrance mixing with the soft murmur of sophisticated conversation and the gentle notes of the string quartet positioned near the grand piano. At the far end of the ballroom, a raised platform held the head table where the most distinguished guests would be seated for the evening's program. The table was set with the finest royal china, each place setting precisely arranged according to centuries-old protocol. Heavy silver cutlery caught the light, and crystal wine glasses stood ready for the evening's toasts. But among all these carefully planned details, one element held particular significance that most guests would never understand. Captain James Whitfield stood at attention near the platform, his red ceremonial uniform immaculate and his bearing perfect after 25 years of service in the Queen's Guard. His weathered hands remained clasped behind his back as his eyes continuously scanned the room, noting every movement, every face, every potential concern. To most observers, he appeared to be just another ceremonial figure, part of the evening's royal pageantry. But James carried with him a responsibility that went far beyond simple security protocols. Earlier that afternoon, James had been summoned to the private office of Sir Edmund Hartley, the palace marshal. The conversation had been brief but loaded with meaning. Sir Edmund, a man who had served the royal household for over 4 decades, had looked tired as he handed James a single sheet of paper containing specific instructions for the evening. "Captain Whitfield," Sir Edmund had said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent navigating the complex protocols of royal life. "Tonight's gala will be held in the state ballroom. The seating arrangements have been finalized according to Her late Majesty's standing orders regarding formal events in that particular room." James had read the instructions carefully. Among the standard security briefings and protocol reminders, one line stood out with particular clarity. The third seat from the right at the head table was to remain unoccupied during the evening's proceedings. No exceptions, no modifications. The instruction bore the seal of Queen Elizabeth II, issued decades earlier and never rescinded. "Sir, if I may ask," James had ventured carefully, "are there any special circumstances I should be aware of regarding this evening's arrangements?" Sir Edmund had looked out the window at the palace gardens for a long moment before responding. "Captain, there are some traditions in this palace that exist for reasons beyond simple protocol. Your job tonight is to ensure those traditions are respected, regardless of who might question them."
As the evening progressed, James watched the distinguished guests find their assigned seats.
The conversations flowed easily, punctuated by gentle laughter and the soft clink of crystal glasses. The charity auction was scheduled to begin shortly, and Lady Margaret had taken her position at the podium to welcome the gathered supporters. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the elegant space, "welcome to this year's Children's Hospital Charity Gala. Tonight, we gather not just to celebrate our continued support for young patients across the Commonwealth, but to honor the memory of those who believe deeply in the power of compassion to change lives. The crowd settled into an attentive silence as Lady Margaret continued her opening remarks. She spoke eloquently about the hospital's recent achievements, the new wing that would soon open thanks to previous fundraising efforts, and the children whose lives had been transformed through the generosity of those gathered in the room. Queen Camilla smiled graciously and applauded at appropriate moments, her royal training evident in every gesture. She had attended countless such events over the years, first as the Duchess of Cornwall and now as Queen Consort. The rhythm of these gatherings had become second nature to her, from the carefully choreographed entrances to the precisely timed speeches and the inevitable photo opportunities with major donors. As Lady Margaret concluded her opening remarks, the guests began to move toward their assigned tables. The soft rustle of evening gowns and the gentle murmur of conversation filled the air as people consulted the elegant seating cards and found their places. The string quartet transitioned into a gentle classical piece that provided a sophisticated backdrop to the social choreography unfolding across the ballroom. James remained at his post, his attention focused particularly on the head table. He watched as various dignitaries found their seats according to the carefully planned arrangement. The Archbishop of Canterbury took his place on the far left, followed by the Chancellor of the Exchequer and his wife. The Secretary of State for Health sat next to the hospital's chief administrator, and several prominent business leaders filled the remaining chairs. The atmosphere was one of refined celebration, the kind of event that the royal household had perfected over generations. Everything moved according to plan, each guest understanding their role in the evening's carefully orchestrated proceedings. The palace staff moved efficiently but unobtrusively, ensuring wine glasses remained filled and that the timing remained on schedule. But James knew that the evening's most delicate moment was yet to come. As Queen Camilla finished her conversations with several prominent guests near the entrance, she began to make her way toward the head table. Her path would naturally lead her to the elevated platform where her designated seat waited among the other distinguished guests. The problem was not with where Queen Camilla was supposed to sit. Her place had been carefully assigned according to proper royal protocol, positioned appropriately for someone of her rank and station. The issue lay with the seat immediately to her right, the third chair from the right side of the table, which bore no place card and no table setting, but which carried a significance that few people in the room truly understood. That particular chair had remained empty at formal events in the state ballroom for over 27 years. It was positioned exactly where Princess Diana had sat during her last official appearance at a palace function before her tragic death in Paris. Queen Elizabeth II had issued the standing order regarding that seat shortly after Diana's funeral, and it had never been modified or rescinded, not even after Elizabeth's own passing. As Queen Camilla approached the head table, James felt his pulse quicken slightly. He had served in the Queen's Guard through multiple royal transitions, protocol changes, and family dramas. He understood better than most that the royal household was built on traditions that sometimes transcended logic or convenience. Tonight, he would be tested on whether those traditions still held meaning in a modern world. The other guests had largely taken their seats, and the room had settled into the expectant quiet that preceded the evening's main program. Queen Camilla paused near the head table, speaking briefly with the Archbishop and accepting a glass of champagne from a passing server. She appeared completely at ease, unaware that her next few movements would create a situation that would test decades of royal protocol. From across the room, James watched carefully as Queen Camilla began to survey the seating arrangement at the head table. He could see her taking note of the empty chair, the missing place setting, and the gap in what should have been a perfectly arranged formal table. To someone unfamiliar with the specific history of that seat, it would appear to be simply an oversight, perhaps a last-minute cancellation that the staff had failed to properly address. James knew that in less than a minute, Queen Camilla would likely attempt to resolve what she perceived as an error in the evening's arrangements. And when that happened, 25 years of military training and royal service would be put to the ultimate test. The weight of tradition, the complexity of royal protocol, and the delicate nature of memory and respect were about to collide in a way that would define not just the remainder of the evening, but potentially the future of how the royal household honored its past while moving forward into a new era. Queen Camilla set her champagne glass down on the pristine white tablecloth and turned her attention to what she perceived as an obvious oversight in the evening's arrangements. The empty chair stood out like a missing piece in an otherwise perfect puzzle, and her years of experience in managing royal events told her that such an error needed immediate correction. "Excuse me," she called softly to a nearby palace staff member, her voice carrying the gentle authority that came naturally to someone of her position. "There seems to be a place set in missing at our table. Could you please have someone address this?" The young server, dressed in the palace's formal black and white uniform, looked confused for a moment. He glanced between Queen Camilla and the empty chair, clearly uncertain about how to respond. The seating arrangements for royal events were planned months in advance and approved at the highest levels. Nothing was ever left to chance, and certainly nothing was ever simply forgotten. "Your Majesty," the server began hesitantly, "I believe the arrangements are as they were specified in the planning documents. Perhaps I should fetch the event coordinator?" But Queen Camilla was already moving toward the empty chair with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to solving problems quickly and quietly. In her mind, this was simply a matter of making the best of an unfortunate situation. One of the distinguished guests would surely need a seat, and leaving an empty chair at the head table would create an awkward gap in what should be an elegant presentation. "Nonsense," she said with a warm smile. "These things happen at large events. I'll simply make use of this seat myself, and we can sort out the proper arrangements later."
From his position near the platform, Captain James Whitfield watched this exchange with growing concern.
He had anticipated this exact scenario during his conversation with Sir Edmund earlier that afternoon, but seeing it unfold in real time still sent a spike of adrenaline through his system. For a moment, he considered whether there might be a diplomatic way to address the situation without creating a scene. Perhaps he could quietly approach one of Queen Camilla's ladies-in-waiting and explain the situation through proper channels. Maybe the palace marshal could be summoned to provide clarification about the seating arrangements. But as James watched Queen Camilla place her hand on the back of the empty chair, he realized that time for subtle intervention had passed. The other guests at the head table were beginning to notice the situation developing before them. The Archbishop of Canterbury looked up from his conversation with the hospital administrator, his eyebrows raised slightly in curiosity. The Chancellor of the Exchequer paused mid-sentence in his discussion about healthcare funding, sensing that something unusual was occurring nearby. Queen Camilla began to pull the chair back from the table, her movements confident and purposeful. She had no reason to suspect that this simple action would violate a deeply held royal protocol. To her, it was merely a practical solution to what appeared to be a planning error. The evening needed to proceed smoothly, and empty chairs at the head table would only draw unwanted attention and speculation from the assembled guests and media representatives. That was the moment when Captain James Whitfield made the decision that would define the remainder of his career in royal service. 25 years of military training had taught him that some orders were absolute, regardless of circumstances or consequences. The standing instructions regarding that particular chair had been clear and unambiguous, and his duty was to ensure they were followed. "Your Majesty," James said, his voice carrying clearly across the immediate area as he stepped forward from his post. The formal tone was respectful but unmistakably firm. "I must ask that you not occupy that particular seat." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, creating a pocket of absolute silence in the midst of the elegant gathering. Queen Camilla froze with her hand still on the chair back, her expression shifting from surprise to confusion. Around the head table, conversation stopped mid-sentence as the other distinguished guests turned to observe this unexpected development. "I beg your pardon?" Queen Camilla said, her voice maintaining its regal composure despite the obvious bewilderment in her tone. In all her years of royal service, first as the Duchess of Cornwall and now as Queen Consort, she had never been directly contradicted by a member of the palace guard, particularly not in such a public setting. James stood at attention, his red ceremonial uniform suddenly feeling heavier than usual. Every eye in the immediate vicinity was now focused on him, and he could sense the weight of history pressing down on this single moment. Behind Queen Camilla, her ladies-in-waiting had stopped their quiet conversation, their faces showing alarm at this unprecedented breach of normal protocol. "Your Majesty," James repeated, his military bearing evident in every word. "That seat is not available for use during this evening's proceedings. I have specific instructions regarding its status, and I must respectfully ask that you choose another chair." The tension in the room was now palpable. Several guests at nearby tables had noticed the unusual interaction taking place at the head table, and the gentle murmur of conversation throughout the ballroom had noticeably diminished. Lady Margaret Thornbury, still standing at the podium, found herself in the awkward position of trying to maintain the evening's momentum, while being unable to ignore the drama unfolding among her most distinguished guests. Queen Camilla's expression hardened slightly as she processed the situation. As Queen Consort, she was accustomed to being treated with the utmost deference and respect. Royal guards were expected to ensure her safety and comfort, not to issue instructions about where she could or could not sit. The public nature of the confrontation made it particularly problematic, as any resolution would now be witnessed by dozens of influential guests who would undoubtedly discuss the incident for months to come.
"Captain," she said, her voice taking on a cooler tone, "I fail to understand why a member of the Queen's Guard believes he has the authority to dictate seating arrangements to members of the royal family. Perhaps you could explain the nature of these specific instructions you mentioned."
James felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the ballroom. He was acutely aware that his next words would either justify his actions or potentially end his career in royal service. But the image of Sir Edmund's serious expression from earlier that afternoon reminded him that some responsibilities transcended personal consequences. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the instructions regarding that chair were issued by Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and have never been rescinded.
The seat is to remain unoccupied during all formal events held in the state ballroom." This revelation sent a ripple of understanding through some of the older guests who had served in royal households for decades. They began to recognize the significance of what was happening, even if the specific details remained unclear to most observers. The Archbishop of Canterbury's expression showed dawning comprehension, and he leaned slightly forward in his chair, clearly recognizing that this situation involved far more than simple protocol confusion.
Queen Camilla's hand remained on the chair back, but her grip had tightened noticeably. The mention of Queen Elizabeth II's orders added a layer of complexity that she hadn't anticipated. As someone who had navigated the intricate world of royal protocol for years, she understood better than most that certain traditions carried weight beyond their apparent logic.
"And what," she asked slowly, "is the specific reason that Queen Elizabeth issued such an instruction?" James hesitated for just a moment, recognizing that his answer would reveal information that had been carefully guarded within palace circles for over 2 decades. But with the direct question posed in such a public setting, he had little choice but to provide the complete truth. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice dropping slightly in volume but losing none of its clarity, "that chair marks the place where Princess Diana sat during her final official appearance at a palace function before her death. Her late Majesty ordered that it remain empty as a mark of respect and remembrance." The silence that followed this explanation was profound and absolute. Even the string quartet seemed to sense the gravity of the moment and allowed their current piece to fade away without beginning another. Queen Camilla's face went through a series of subtle changes as she processed the implications of what she had just learned. Around the room, guests who had been following the conversation began to whisper quietly among themselves. Some were old enough to remember Princess Diana's last palace appearance, and the significance of preserving that particular seat began to make emotional sense even to those who might question the practical necessity of such a gesture. Queen Camilla slowly removed her hand from the chair back, her expression now showing a mixture of understanding and something that might have been regret. She had lived through the complicated years of public transition from Diana's death through her own eventual acceptance as a member of the royal family. She understood better than anyone the delicate balance between honoring the past and moving forward into the future. But even as she stepped away from the chair, the larger questions remained unresolved. The evening's program still needed to proceed, the guests were still watching, and the implications of this public confrontation would extend far beyond the confines of the charity gala. Captain James Whitfield had successfully protected a decades-old royal tradition, but at what cost to the delicate relationships that kept the modern monarchy functioning smoothly? The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds in reality. Queen Camilla stood motionless beside the empty chair, her composed royal mask firmly in place despite the emotional complexity of the situation she now found herself navigating. Around the head table, the other distinguished guests maintained careful, neutral expressions, each understanding that they had become unwitting witnesses to a moment that would likely be analysed and discussed in royal circles for years to come. Lady Margaret Thornbury, still positioned at the podium, found herself faced with a challenge no event planning manual could have prepared her for. The carefully orchestrated timeline for the evening had come to a complete halt, and she needed to find a way to restore momentum without drawing further attention to the unprecedented confrontation that had just unfolded. She cleared her throat gently and attempted to redirect the room's energy. "Perhaps," Lady Margaret announced with practiced diplomacy, "we might take a brief intermission to allow our distinguished guests to settle in properly before we begin the evening's auction presentations." This suggestion provided a welcome opportunity for movement and conversation that helped to dissipate some of the tension that had built around the head table. Guests throughout the ballroom began to mingle again,
though their discussions were now punctuated by furtive glances toward the platform where Queen Camilla remained standing beside the controversial chair. Queen Camilla's personal secretary, Mrs. Victoria Ashford, approached discreetly from the side of the platform. She had served in the royal household for over 15 years and possessed an expert understanding of how to manage delicate situations with minimal public exposure. Her arrival provided Queen Camilla with an opportunity to step away from the immediate area while maintaining her dignity and composure. "Your Majesty," Mrs. Ashford said quietly, "perhaps we might review the seating arrangements in the adjacent chamber for a moment." Queen Camilla nodded graciously and allowed herself to be guided away from the head table toward a smaller reception room that connected to the main ballroom. As they walked, she maintained her regal bearing, acknowledging guests with subtle smiles and nods, giving no outward indication of the internal processing that was undoubtedly taking place. Captain James Whitfield remained at his post near the platform, though he was acutely aware that his actions had fundamentally altered the dynamics of the evening. Several of his colleagues from the Queen's Guard had noticed the unusual interaction, and he could sense their curiosity about what had transpired. In the military precision of royal security, public confrontations with members of the royal family were virtually unheard of. Sir Edmund Hartley materialized at James's side with the quiet efficiency that had made him invaluable to the royal household for decades. His weathered face showed no emotion, but James could sense the older man's concern about the potential ramifications of the evening's events. "Captain," Sir Edmund said in a voice barely above a whisper, "perhaps you could provide me with a brief report on the situation." James maintained his professional posture as he replied, "Sir, I followed the standing instructions regarding the state ballroom seating arrangements." Queen Camilla attempted to occupy the restricted seat, and I informed her of the protocols in place. Sir Edmund nodded slowly, his experienced eyes scanning the room to assess the mood of the gathered guests. "And how did Her Majesty respond to this information?" "She appeared surprised by the existence of the restriction," James reported honestly, "but she stepped away from the chair once the historical context was explained." In the adjacent reception room, Queen Camilla was having a very different conversation with Mrs. Ashford and her lady-in-waiting, Lady Caroline Wessex. The smaller space provided privacy for a discussion that needed to address both the immediate practical concerns and the broader implications of what had occurred. "Ma'am,"
Mrs.
Ashford began carefully, "it appears there was some confusion about the specific protocols governing tonight's seating arrangements. The Palace Marshal's office maintains certain standing orders that date back to Queen Elizabeth's reign, and it seems this particular instruction was not included in the standard briefing materials." Queen Camilla settled into a comfortable chair near the window, finally allowing some of her composure to relax now that she was away from public scrutiny. The weight of the evening's revelation was beginning to settle, and she found herself grappling with emotions that were far more complex than simple embarrassment or frustration. "Diana's chair," she said quietly, almost to herself. "All these years, and no one thought to mention that there was a shrine being maintained in the state ballroom." Lady Caroline shifted uncomfortably in her seat. As someone who had served in the royal household during Diana's lifetime and through the difficult years that followed her death, she understood the delicate balance that the royal family had been forced to maintain between public mourning and private healing. "Ma'am," Lady Caroline offered gently, "it's possible that the instruction was considered so routine by the senior palace staff that they didn't think to include it in standard briefing materials. These kinds of long-standing protocols sometimes become invisible to those who implement them regularly." Queen Camilla considered this possibility, but she also recognized that the situation reflected larger tensions about her role within the royal family and the ongoing public fascination with Diana's memory. Even decades after her death, Diana remained a powerful presence in British cultural consciousness, and Queen Camilla had always been measured against that legacy. Meanwhile, back in the main ballroom, the guests were beginning to engage in the kind of subdued speculation that followed any unusual royal incident. The older attendees, particularly those who had been present at various royal functions over the decades, were sharing their knowledge about palace protocols and the significance of various traditions that most people never observed directly. The Archbishop of Canterbury found himself in conversation with Lord Pemberton, a senior member of the House of Lords, who had served on various royal committees for over 30 years. Their discussion reflected the broader questions that the evening's events had raised about tradition, change, and the role of memory in modern royal practice. "I must admit," Lord Pemberton said quietly, "I had heard whispers about certain protocols related to Princess Diana, but I never imagined they were still being actively enforced after all these years." The Archbishop nodded thoughtfully.
The challenge facing the royal family has always been balancing respect for the past with the practical needs of the present. Tonight's incident suggests that balance may need to be reconsidered. Their conversation was typical of many taking place throughout the room. Guests were grappling with questions about whether maintaining an empty chair for nearly 3 decades represented touching devotion or unhealthy attachment to the past. The opinions varied significantly depending on the speaker's age, their relationship to the royal family, and their personal memories of Diana and the circumstances of her death. Back in the reception room, Queen Camilla had made a decision about how to proceed with the remainder of the evening. Her years of experience in navigating complex social situations had taught her that decisive action was usually preferable to prolonged uncertainty, even when the available options were all potentially problematic. "Mrs. Ashford," she said with renewed determination, "I want you to speak with Lady Margaret about modifying the evening's program. I will not be taking a seat at the head table tonight. Instead, I'll circulate among the other guests and participate in the auction from the floor." This decision represented a significant departure from standard royal protocol, but it offered a way to complete the evening without further confronting the symbolic importance of the empty chair. It also demonstrated a level of gracious flexibility that would likely be noted and appreciated by the other attendees. Mrs. Ashford nodded approvingly. "That's a very thoughtful solution, ma'am. It will allow the evening to proceed while respecting the existing arrangements." But even as they planned this practical resolution to the immediate problem, all 3 women understood that the larger questions raised by the evening's events would not be so easily resolved. The incident had highlighted fundamental tensions about how the royal family should honor Diana's memory, while allowing Queen Camilla to fully embrace her role as queen consort. When they returned to the main ballroom 15 minutes later, Queen Camilla's modified approach to the evening was immediately apparent to the other guests. Instead of taking her expected place at the head table, she moved gracefully through the crowd, engaging in conversations with various attendees and showing particular interest in the charity auction items that were displayed around the room. Captain James Whitfield watched this development with a mixture of relief and continued concern. Queen Camilla's decision to avoid the head table had eliminated the immediate protocol conflict, but he wondered about the long-term implications of the evening's events. Would there be an investigation into his actions? Would the standing orders regarding Diana's chair finally be reviewed and potentially rescinded? As the evening progressed, the auction began in earnest, with Lady Margaret skillfully managing the bidding while maintaining the elegant atmosphere that such events required. Queen Camilla participated enthusiastically, bidding successfully on a collection of rare books that would be donated to one of her patronage organizations. But beneath the surface normalcy, everyone present understood that they had witnessed something significant. The confrontation between royal tradition and modern practicality had played out in full view, raising questions about how long-held customs should be maintained when they conflict with contemporary needs and relationships. The empty chair remained at the head table throughout the evening, a silent reminder of the complex emotions and loyalties that continued to shape the royal family nearly 3 decades after Princess Diana's death. Some guests found its presence touching and appropriate, while others wondered whether the time had come to retire such symbolic gestures in favor of a more forward-looking approach to royal protocol. As the auction concluded and guests began to prepare for departure, the conversations continued in small groups throughout the ballroom. The evening had raised far more questions than it had answered, and the ripple effects of Captain Whitfield's decision to enforce a decades-old protocol would continue to be felt long after the last guest had left Buckingham Palace. 3 days after the charity gala, Buckingham Palace hummed with an undercurrent of tension that was unusual even by the standards of an institution accustomed to managing delicate situations. The incident at the Children's Hospital charity gala had not made it into the mainstream press, largely due to the discretion of the guests who had witnessed it, but within royal circles it had become the subject of intense discussion and debate. Sir Edmund Hartley sat in his oak-panelled office, reviewing a stack of memoranda that had accumulated since the evening's events. As Palace Marshal, he was responsible for ensuring that royal protocols were followed correctly, but he was also charged with adapting those protocols when circumstances required modification. The situation with Diana's chair had forced him to confront questions he had been avoiding for years. The morning's first meeting was with Captain James Whitfield, who entered the office with the same precise military bearing he had displayed throughout his career. James understood that his actions at the gala would either be vindicated or result in significant professional consequences, but he had no regrets about following the standing orders he had been given. "Captain," Sir Edmund began, settling back in his leather chair, "I've spent the past 3 days reviewing the documentation surrounding the standing orders for state ballroom events. Your adherence to those protocols was technically correct, but the circumstances have raised questions that need to be addressed." James remained at attention as he replied, "Sir,
I understood my instructions to be absolute regarding that particular seating arrangement. Was I incorrect in that interpretation? Sir Edmund studied the younger man for a moment before responding. No, Captain. Your interpretation was accurate, based on the orders as they were written. However, the incident has highlighted the need for a comprehensive review of certain long-standing protocols, particularly those that may conflict with the practical needs of the current royal family structure. This conversation was taking place against the backdrop of much larger discussions happening throughout the palace. Queen Camilla had requested a private meeting with King Charles to discuss the implications of the Gala incident, not just for her personally, but for the monarchy's approach to honouring the past while embracing the future. The King's study, located in the private apartments of Buckingham Palace, provided a setting for conversations that required both privacy and informality. King Charles had been dealing with questions about Diana's memory throughout his adult life, first as her husband, then as her former husband, and now as the monarch who had to balance that complex history with the needs of his current marriage and reign. The situation has become untenable, Queen Camilla said, settling into the familiar comfort of the chair she had occupied during countless private conversations over the years. I cannot continue to navigate around invisible memorials that no one thought to mention. If there are other protocols like this in place, I need to know about them. King Charles nodded thoughtfully, understanding the frustration behind his wife's words. The challenge is that many of these arrangements were put in place during emotionally charged periods and then became so routine that they faded into the background of palace operations. Mother's generation often preferred to handle difficult situations through unspoken understandings rather than explicit policies. But unspoken understandings become problematic when they conflict with practical realities, Queen Camilla replied. The empty chair may have made sense as a temporary gesture of respect, but maintaining it for nearly 3 decades sends a message that we're unable to move forward as an institution. This conversation reflected broader questions that the royal family had been grappling with since King Charles's accession to the throne. How should they balance respect for Queen Elizabeth's wishes with the need to establish new traditions that reflected current realities? How much should the memory of Diana continue to influence royal protocols, particularly as it related to Queen Camilla's role and status? Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, Prince William was having his own conversation about the incident with his private secretary, Simon Patterson. As Diana's eldest son and the heir to the throne, William's perspective on how his mother's memory should be honoured carried particular weight within the royal household. I appreciate the sentiment behind the gesture, William said, looking out the window at the palace gardens where he had played as a child, but I don't think Mother would have wanted her memory to create ongoing complications for Camilla or anyone else in the family. She understood better than anyone how important it is for the institution to function smoothly. Simon Patterson had served as William's private secretary for 5 years and had developed a deep understanding of how the prince navigated the complex emotions surrounding his mother's death and its ongoing impact on the royal family. Your Royal Highness, would you like me to communicate your thoughts to the Palace Marshal's office as they review these protocols? William considered the question carefully. Yes, but frame it appropriately. I want it clear that I support honouring Mother's memory in meaningful ways, but not in ways that create ongoing tension or practical problems for the family. Back in Sir Edmund's office, the conversation with Captain James had moved into a broader discussion about how royal security and protocol officers should handle situations where long-standing orders might conflict with contemporary needs. The reality, Sir Edmund explained, is that you were placed in an impossible position. Following orders is fundamental to military service, but those orders should be reviewed regularly to ensure they remain appropriate and practical. James appreciated the senior official's understanding, but he remained concerned about the precedent that might be set. Sir, if we begin questioning standing orders based on contemporary comfort rather than explicit revisions, how do we maintain the consistency that royal protocol requires? It was a thoughtful question that highlighted one of the fundamental challenges facing any institution that balanced tradition with adaptation. Sir Edmund had been considering this exact issue since the night of the gala, and he had reached some preliminary conclusions about how to move forward. Captain, what we need is a comprehensive review of all standing orders that date back more than a decade, with particular attention to those that may have been issued under emotional or temporary circumstances. This review will determine which protocols should be maintained, which should be modified, and which should be retired entirely. This approach would require careful consultation with multiple members of the royal family, senior palace staff, and even constitutional scholars who specialized in royal protocol. The goal would be to preserve meaningful traditions while eliminating practices that had outlived their usefulness or created unnecessary complications. Later that afternoon, Queen Camilla received a call from Prince William, who wanted to express his support for finding a resolution that honored everyone involved in the situation. The conversation, while private, represented an important step toward healing any potential family tensions that might have emerged from the Gala incident.
Camilla, William said, his voice carrying the warmth that had developed between them over years of shared family experiences, I wanted you to know that Harry and I both appreciate how you handled yourself at the Gala. Mother would have been impressed by your grace under pressure.
Queen Camilla felt a wave of relief at these words. She had been concerned that Diana's sons might view the incident as disrespectful to their mother's memory, when her intention had simply been to solve what appeared to be a practical problem. "Thank you, William," she replied. "I hope we can find a way to honor Diana's memory that doesn't create ongoing complications for family events." "I think we can," William assured her. "In fact, Harry and I have been discussing some ideas for a more active memorial that would be meaningful without being restrictive. Perhaps it's time to replace symbolic gestures with substantive action." This conversation sparked the beginning of what would become a comprehensive reimagining of how the royal family honored Diana's legacy. Instead of maintaining empty chairs and other passive memorials, they began developing plans for active charitable initiatives that would embody Diana's commitment to helping vulnerable populations. The week following the gala, Sir Edmund convened a small committee consisting of senior palace officials, representatives from the king's household, and Prince William's office to review all standing orders related to memorial protocols. Their work would take several months, but the outcome would be a modernized approach to royal tradition that maintained meaningful connections to the past while eliminating practices that had become counterproductive. Captain James Whitfield was commended for his adherence to duty, but was also reassigned to a position that would not require him to enforce potentially contradictory protocols. The reassignment was presented as a promotion, recognizing his years of faithful service while removing him from situations where similar conflicts might arise. The empty chair in the state ballroom was quietly retired, replaced by a beautiful memorial garden that was created in one of the palace courtyards. The garden featured Diana's favorite flowers and included a bench where visitors could sit and reflect. This new memorial was visible and accessible while not interfering with the practical needs of royal events. 6 months later, Queen Camilla hosted another charity gala in the state ballroom, this time to benefit a mental health initiative that had been one of Diana's particular interests. The event proceeded smoothly, with full family participation and no protocol complications. The memorial garden had been dedicated earlier that day, with both Prince William and Prince Harry speaking about their appreciation for a tribute that honored their mother's memory through continued service, rather than empty symbolism. The incident at the Children's Hospital Charity Gala became a turning point in how the royal family approached the balance between tradition and adaptation. It demonstrated that even the most well-established institutions must periodically examine their practices to ensure they remain meaningful and functional. Captain James Whitfield, now serving in a senior training role for new members of the Queen's Guard, often used the incident as a case study for young officers learning about the complexities of royal service. His message was always the same. Duty requires following orders, but wisdom requires understanding when those orders need to be reviewed and updated. The evening that had begun with such tension and uncertainty ultimately led to positive changes that strengthened both the royal family's unity and their commitment to honoring the past while embracing the future. The empty chair had been replaced by something far more meaningful, a renewed sense of purpose and a clearer understanding of how tradition could evolve without losing its essential meaning. Years later, when royal biographers wrote about this period in the monarchy's history, they would note that the confrontation at the charity gala, uncomfortable as it was at the time, had catalyzed important conversations about memory, respect, and the practical challenges of maintaining historical institutions in a contemporary world. Sometimes, they concluded, the most significant changes begin with the simple words, "Not today."